I'm Jen Landry, director here at the Irving Archives and Museum. Welcome to today's IAM virtual talk, Spit Spreads Death, the Influenza Pandemic of 1918-19 in Philadelphia by Dr. Robert Hicks in conjunction with our just completed tour of the traveling exhibition World War I America. We begin today's gathering with an acknowledgement. We respectfully acknowledge that the museum is on the traditional ancestral lands of the Kickapoo, Tawakoni, and Wichita nations. The process of knowing and acknowledging the land we stand on is a way of honoring and expressing gratitude for the ancestral people who were on this land before us. Thank you. I'm going to give an introduction shortly, but wanted to first encourage everyone as you listen today to use the chat feature for your questions. We'll have some time at the end for Dr. Hicks to answer any questions and have a bit of a discussion. We also wanted to let you know that IAM is now open with regular hours, hooray, Wednesday through Saturday from 10 a.m. to 4. Tickets may be purchased in advance through our website, irvingarchivesandmuseum.com, or in person at the museum store. On June 12th, we will be opening our next temporary exhibition, A History of Walls, The Borders We Build. And of course, the Irving Story and Spark Lab are ready to welcome you. If you have young people in your life looking for summer activities, we certainly encourage you to come out and check out Spark Lab. Now, by way of introduction, today's honorable speaker is Dr. Robert Hicks. Robert is a senior consulting scholar and William Malmesey Chair of the History of Medicine of the College of Physicians of Philadelphia, which is the oldest private medical society in the United States. For over a decade, he served as director of the Motor Museum and Historical Medical Library at the college. Robert has worked with museum-based education and exhibits for over 3 decades. He has a doctorate in maritime history from the University of Exeter in the UK and degrees in anthropology and archaeology from the University of Arizona. A published author, Robert's most recent book, Civil War Medicine, A Surgeon's Experience, appeared in 2019 by Indiana University Press. And he has also somehow found time to have served as a naval officer with the U.S. Naval Security Group and had a career in law enforcement. Personally, I've had the pleasure to call Robert first a boss, then colleague and friend for over 17 years. Yes, it has been that long because it predates Lucas, my 16-year-old. I worked with Robert in the planning and development of the museum at the Science History Institute, where we perhaps conspired on more than one occasion to push the institution to become more approachable to a wide range of audiences. It was good trouble. Robert is an excellent historian, exhibit developer, and researcher, but most importantly, he is a great storyteller, and that was what makes him such a great historian. And today he will be sharing a topic of particular relevance to us all after the last 18 months. Robert, I turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Jen, for that introduction. And it's nice to be working with you again.
Yes.
And thank you also to Claire for setting this all up. And thank you to the audience for tuning in. If you haven't had enough of pandemics before now, you're going to get some more. But I hope you'll find some interesting questions in all this and some interesting tangents from 1918 till now. On the screen, you see some images along with my little bona fides, and it's to highlight the patriotic imagery. And mindful of your exploration of World War I, patriotic imagery means a big deal during this pandemic of 1918. We also see a familiar image of a nurse, and you may see this on this nurse image. The laser pointer is showing her dark collar, and there's a little button poking through. And I call your attention to that because I will come back to that later on for a reason. And the Spit Spreads Death sign, which will become evident where that comes from in a moment. I am representing the institution of the College of Physicians of Philadelphia, as Jen mentioned. We bear this National Historic Landmark status, birthplace of American medicine, because Philadelphia was one of the 2 cities, along with Boston, where medicine implanted an American identity, not a European one, in what became the United States. So physicians who were members of our college, which was not a teaching organization, but a professional fraternal organization, were doctors that founded big institutions. So Philadelphia had the first hospital in the United States, the first hospitals of specialties, such as the first hospital specializing in the eye, first hospital specializing in children. The list goes on and on. Also, the first women's college of medicine. So we are a city of medical firsts. I'm starting this story with this institution just outside of Philly, St. Joseph College. In the fall of 1918, in October, when the pandemic was at its height in Philadelphia, the college here canceled its classes and they summoned all the seminary students together and they said, look, Philadelphia is in the grip of a pandemic. It's out of control as far as the city is concerned. We have to volunteer and do what we can to help people. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to pair up seminary students in twos, and we're going to assign to each pair a cart and a horse. Your job is to walk up and down neighborhood streets and call out for the dead. Take them to a cemetery or other designated location where these bodies may be buried. Now, think about that for a moment. This is October 1918. You're in a country with airplanes and radio and cars, and it's a modern city. And you are putting students with horse-drawn carts to take away the dead. And I've just given you the recollection of one of those seminary students, Frank Bieberstein, who lived through the pandemic as Philadelphia experienced it and told this tale. He pointed out that he and his partner would take turns going into private homes to help drag out bodies and place them in the cart. So this was a scene out of medieval Europe. In fact, what you see here in the photograph is seminary students digging some of the mass graves that are around Philadelphia, none of which are marked as such. So 1918, this is the year of my focus, and particularly focusing on the last half of the year. Now, politically, the United States is at war, but with our other issues. In fact, Congress is about to deal with legislation that's been proposed to give women the vote. That's in discussion at the moment. But the big issue, of course, is the war. Now, the United States enters World War I in 1917, but it's not until the fall of 1918 that US forces experience participation in their first major offensive of the war. But at this moment, there are 1,500,000 US soldiers in France. The devastation is already there on their arrival because Europe, of course, has been at war for years before that. Now, the patriotic imagery I called attention to at the outset. Here you see one of the more threatening posters of the time. And these kinds of images of the Germans are abundant. And if there's one ethnic group everybody hates at the moment, it's the Germans. They're suspected of spying, of sabotage, communicating information to the enemy. And if you are of German descent and have a German surname, God help you. German soldiers on these posters all have a bloody knife or bloody bayonet. They have no necks. They have very big boots, and they're looking for your girls. They're looking for your women. That's what the expression on that face means. So that's the real threat, of course. They're going to take our women. But if you were hearing me talk in a public place, before I could speak to you in 1918, you would have to hear from what was called a 4-minute man. 4-minute men were government-paid men who would get up and give you a short, patriotic, rah-rah speech, not exceeding 4 minutes, in order to get you to buy war bonds. There's a big effort going on at the moment in 1918 to get people to empty their wallets as they can to support the war effort. Now, Philadelphia at the time, and I'm focusing on Philadelphia for this presentation for several reasons, the main one being is that's where I am, and the Mutter Museum, where I was up until recently director, instituted, and it's still up and will be up for years, a major exhibition on the flu in Philadelphia. Philadelphia at this time has a population figure you see here. It's got the largest shipyard in the world, which means it's turning out a lot of military ships. And 35,000 workers alone work in that domain of the city. It consumes a lot of territory, and all these people are living mostly in almost poverty level housing as temporary lodging, because these people are going to follow the war work or any other work that's available that's willing to pay them. So there are a lot of immigrant populations, Italians, a good example, Russian immigrants in Philadelphia at the moment. Now, this is not a good time for a disease to break out in the city because 75% of the hospital staff at Pennsylvania Hospital are with the Army in France. That's 75% of their staff. On average, hospitals citywide are diminished by approximately 25 to 30% of their staff. So we don't have a full complement of nurses or doctors or any other kind of health professional to help with this. Problems begin in the press as far as Philadelphians are concerned. They're hearing that there are outbreaks in and around Boston and that outbreaks of flu have happened in the Army camps. Now, the Spanish flu is what has appeared in the newspapers. And you see it on the sign, Spanish influenza, which is a sign at the Philadelphia shipyard. There's nothing at all Spanish about the flu, except that Spain was not exercising censorship on reports about the flu and flu devastation within Spain, whereas all the countries participating in the war effort were doing that, including the United States. Anything that would militate against the war effort was sidelined from the news, and this disease threat in our very midst is a threat to that. So multiple cities are catching the flu, and there appear to be multiple waves of the flu, where some cities seems to get a bump of reported cases, at least a lot of hospitalizations, then it may diminish for a time, then come back. That could be a second variant of the flu doing that. Now, a British merchant ship shows up in Philadelphia in late summer in August, the city of Exeter. And just as with crews today on merchant ships, they come from all over the place. And there happened to be a number of crewmen, particularly from India, aboard. So many of them are sick. Where they might have picked up the flu is anybody's guess. They've been from port to port to port, interacting with other sailors of other nationalities. And the public health officials are on notice that this is happening elsewhere. It's going to show up in Philadelphia eventually, and here it is showing up in and around the Navy Yard. The merchant ship in this case had flu cases that were taken under quarantine to a city hospital, kept under quarantine there, and then as they recovered, returned to their ship. But it meant the disease is implanted in the city. In fact, children are picking up on all the discussion and some of the incoming reports about the flu. And they're reviving a skip rope rhyme from a previous flu outbreak. I had a little bird and its name was Enza. I opened up the window and in flew Enza. This word has been in the English-speaking vocabulary for about 5 centuries. But its original meaning, same derivation as the word influence, is astrological, an influence from the cosmos, something we can't determine. So it's coming from something bigger than us and outside of us and bringing a disease. By the time of the flu in 1918, everybody recognizes influenza as having a common set of symptoms that could also be fatal. Now, we arrive in September. One person that you should meet is the public health director for the city, Dr. Wilmer Cruzen. In some books about the flu pandemic of 1918, he gets some bad press, but that's probably overemphasized. He was reluctant to declare that we had a flu epidemic problem before anybody started talking about a pandemic. But the 4th Naval District is the district where the shipyards are. And while flu cases were erupting there, a number of sailors were transferred from the Boston yard to the Philadelphia one who conveyed flu with them. So there's an outbreak of hundreds of cases in the Naval District. Cruzen, of course, is very interested in keeping that confined to the degree possible. When we talk about the disease and its progress, we make a distinction between mortality and morbidity. Mortality, of course, people who die. Morbidity are the people who get sick, do not die necessarily, but then they transfer into a different category if they do. But these days, physicians, private practice, hospitals all have to report disease statistics. But in 1918, this wasn't so. There was no national reporting mechanism. But it was under the authority of Dr. Cruzen to declare something a reportable disease, meaning any doctor seeing this disease in any context must report it to his office. So by the 3rd week of September, he's declaring it a reportable disease. There are times at which he says to the public, we don't really have a problem here. The average city mortality for all causes isn't significantly up. maybe we're getting upwards of about 5 to 10 mortality cases of the flu a day. But compared to other things that go wrong in a city of this magnitude, that's not really unusual. But he does have his eye on a parade coming up, and the parade could be troublesome. Remember I said there's a fundraising loan going on. Well, cities are creating fundraising parades, known as Liberty Loan parades, and Philadelphia has its scheduled for September 28th. The parade takes place. It is the largest parade in Philadelphia history. The parade route is 6 miles long. About 220,000 people lined the street for this parade. As I said, this was a huge turning out. Now, mindful of our social distancing requirements today, think of what it means. You don't see any distancing going on here. And social distancing was not a term used in 1918. Even when the flu struck, people were advised by public health authorities to avoid personal contact. And they recognized that you could just exchange the flu by breathing on somebody. It required no more than that. So there's some worry about the contagion outbreak that could result from this parade. Now, Cruzen did not come and see the parade this day. On this very day, he was out looking for locations for temporary hospitals. And he actually opens a temporary hospital with 400 beds on this very day in anticipation of something happening. Now, the newspapers you see here are reporting on a parade, not in Philly, but in Chicago, which happened the very day before. And if you look at the lower image, oops, laser pointer, I've got it showing you a man in a black morning suit with a top hat and a parade. That's President of the United States, Woodrow Wilson. He was in that parade. That parade, like this one, is designed to get people to buy bonds, buy war bonds, empty your pockets. And if you bought bonds, you got one of these buttons. And notice in the upper right-hand corner, it says Fourth Liberty Loan, little blue button. Now, this poster in the upper left was in Philadelphia trolleys. Refers to this button as an honor button. If you bought war bonds, you were given a button. You'd wear the button. And there was a great deal of public shaming that went on if you didn't, even in this poster. You see there's one man who's looking down under the brim of his hat. He's got a dark green suit, arms crossed. He does not have a button. He did not buy a Fourth Liberty Loan Fund Drive bond. But notice everybody else, including the kids on that trolley, are happy, healthy. Obviously, wearing the button means you can't get sick. And saying, we did our bit for the country, we bought them. And you get more graphic imagery directed right between your eyes, such as the one at left. You buy that bond or I perish. Now, Cruzen is working fast now because he needs emergency funds in anticipation of supplies he's going to have to get. There is no city plan at this time, and it's true of most American cities, dealing with a disease outbreak of a serious magnitude. But on September 30th, 2 days after the parade, he announces that Philadelphia officially has an epidemic. Now, the last point on this slide, 72 hours after the parade ended, every hospital bed in Philadelphia was filled. It happened that quickly. Remember what I said about the lack of fully staffed hospital personnel. So into the first week in October, look what happens. Mortality, first week, second week, third week. The city morgue at this time only had a capacity for about 35 beds. So guess what happened? The weather's warm, no place to freeze bodies, such as we are having to do in some hospitals and morgues throughout the country because of COVID. So the dead pile up. People take them to the city morgue, pile them in the hallways or outside, but it becomes an uncontrollable problem. And services are breaking down because the flu is striking everywhere. We really do have a blue flu going on in Philadelphia, legitimately, with police officers calling in sick. So the police are now under strength, and it's hitting everywhere. So by the week of October 23rd, we get the highest death count this country's experienced due to disease since the country's beginning. Notice the patriotic posters. But I call your attention to the lamppost image at the right, Spit Spreads Death, which is the irresistible title of my presentation. When that parade was taking place, you probably noticed there are flags decorating everywhere. There are also patriotic banners being placed on lampposts and on the sides of buildings. But the transition from the parade and the patriotic imagery to public health signs was overnight. So there's no time to take down the patriotic banners. So the spit spreads death sign is actually superimposed on a patriotic banner. So that communicates the rapidity with which this is happening. Here you have a temporary hospital bed. The newspapers are starting to pick up on this and reporting about the dead, and in some cases, anecdotes throughout the city. If notable people, socialites, for example, well-known in high society are dying, they get lengthy obituaries in the press. Censorship starts to open up a little bit in this regard, but Philadelphia begins reporting on its own miseries. Closures are taking place. If you can recall the COVID shutdown of March of 2020 and how that sort of happened over the course of a week and everything closing down, didn't work that way in Philadelphia when the death rate skyrocketed. What they did close were the leisure industries, the theaters, the pool houses, the sports, but everybody else had to go to work. You don't get paid days off. There's a war going on. And if you're feeling ill, damn it, you still have to get up and go and work in that war-related factory. That is the public narrative. It's not the flu, it's the war. We have to support the troops. We have to support the war effort. Here you see another photograph that was published in the paper showing mass graves being dug just to receive all of these corpses. So when I say infrastructure failure, it's not just the police, but remember, to make telephone calls at this time, you had to go through a switchboard. A switchboard was operated by a person, a woman in most cases, and they're calling in sick. So the word is being put out. If you have to make a telephone call, treat it as an emergency. It has to be an emergency. Otherwise, we can't compete with everybody making calls for non-essential reasons. There are just not enough people on the switchboard. But people are resorting to some extreme measures. Remember, this is an era where doctors still make house calls. The few doctors that there are, that is. There was a newspaper article about a doctor who went to a neighborhood on call to deal with a flu case. When that doctor emerged from that house, there were approximately 50 to 60 people surrounding his car and surrounding the house, all saying, "You don't leave until you go to my house next, and I'll pay you to do it." And before that doctor was allowed to leave the neighborhood, he made 50 house calls to 50 flu victims before he could get out. Stories like that abounded with nurses who, of course, are showing up in a uniform, an identifiable uniform. People were even offering up to $100 bribes to get nurses to come to their house first. And think about $100 in 1918 terms. Now, I have highlighted in yellow here this quotation about any person with two hands and a willingness to work, because for me, this is sort of a spine-tingling moment, because the last big epidemic to hit Philadelphia was in 1792, 1793, when Philadelphia was the capital of the young United States. And Congress had met in Philadelphia, vacated the town when that happened, and they didn't think that they had the legal ability to meet anywhere else and conduct the business of the country. So Congress shut down. The mayor put out in the newspaper in the 1790s an ad that said, any person, two hands, willingness to work for a day, report in the morning to the city hall and we'll give you a job to do. That was in the 1790s. The exact same thing now in 1918. Volunteers desperately needed. So let's look at the flu for just a moment. Its incubation time is about 1 to 3 days. No symptoms during that time. Then you get the flu, and it's a almost 10 days to 2 week period to try to pull out of it. Now, we tend sometimes to use flu interchangeably with bad cold because the symptoms can be similar, but the flu is really its own thing. And the pain, the aches in the joints, coughing, exhaustion are familiar symptoms. The more severe cases, other things start to go wrong, like the mucous membranes start to get inflamed. But you can also get some strange sensory distortions. For example, your color vision can be distorted and you see everything in sort of a pewter or gray hue. You can become disoriented, suffer from insomnia, you can hallucinate, and you can start bleeding from places you're not supposed to bleed, like your eyes. You can even lose teeth. Now, in the real extreme cases, you get cyanotic look, like this man here, where his skin is turning blue. His body is being starved for oxygen. Why is that happening? Because the flu virus has very cunning features to it. It gets into your lungs and it cracks open the cells, the alveoli, that transfer the oxygen into the bloodstream, the oxygen you inhale. And when those cells disintegrate, there's no mechanism to get oxygen into the blood, so you're starved for oxygen. Your lungs essentially become a frothy, bloody mix. They no longer function the way they're supposed to. In those extreme cases where those symptoms show up, mortality is likely to result. But I have this phrase up here, musty straw. People describe flu victims as having a very distinct odor about their bodies, that of musty straw. So in the absence of official guidance, people come up with their own ideas and solutions. And one of my favorite, and the thing that happens every time there's a disease outbreak, is here's a home remedy that worked for my kids, it'll work for yours, whatever that might be. And we've certainly seen these kinds of things happen for COVID. Dare I say bleach being one of those. That didn't come up in 1918, but here's an example. In fact, when we opened the Spit Spreads Death exhibition at the museum, for the reception, we gave out red pepper sandwiches to people. And I can say, to my best knowledge, that not a single person who ate a red pepper sandwich that night came down with COVID or the flu. So think about it. Now, nurses, obviously familiar. Here they are in an assembly line making masks, gauze masks. Now, masks would not have been very effective where the flu is concerned. The flu is a virus. In 1918, they did not know exactly what that looked like, how it behaved. It had not been isolated in a laboratory. And therefore, they couldn't target a vaccine for it, although they tried to come up with some vaccines, none of which really worked. The mask of gauze layers could possibly contain some of the sputum as you exhale, and thus limit the spread of some secondary diseases that might be in some of the little globules that you emit. Now, I call your attention to the sign in the back. It shows a nurse, and what you can't see is a wounded soldier. And it says, and this is directed to nurses, if I fail, he dies. It shows you the stark nature of a lot of this patriotic imagery that places personal responsibility on everybody who reads the poster, that if you don't do your bit, somebody's going to die. In fact, in 1918, the two worst things you could say about people is to call somebody a hoarder because they're hoarding goods and not allowing other people their fair share, or that you're a slacker. You're not doing your best. You're not performing your duty. So if you didn't buy your war bonds, you are definitely in slacker territory. But I want to remind you too, with this kind of imagery, the anti-German sentiment is still riding very high. In fact, Bayer aspirin, which did exist at the time, and Bayer being a German company, had to cease manufacturing aspirin for a while because of a widespread public belief that the aspirin was embedded with flu germs. There were lynchings across the country of suspected German spies. Some of this went to absurd length, like killing dachshunds because of their German breed. But there was a man who came to Philadelphia that some people thought behaved like a German spy, and he checked into a hotel. These people called the police showed up. He was a traveling salesman. His surname was Thomas, but he was found next morning in his room with his throat cut. Police said that was a suicide. Now, the fund drive ends while this pandemic is still in its full expression. And oddly enough, Philadelphia not only met, but exceeded its fundraising goals for that fund drive. But I'll call your attention to this next point, the Philadelphia Council of National Defense, Bureau of Information, and it's related to that little advertisement at the bottom for influenza sufferers. This was a council that was created as the United States entered the war. And people of influence in the town, maybe industry leaders, politicians, people with a lot of money, were put on this board, and it had a major function. It was to oversee the working conditions and the labor wages for people engaged in war work, so that if you were manufacturing item X over here, you were getting the same pay as somebody manufacturing item X in another factory. So the people that were on this said, look, we've got this epidemic raging through the city. Why don't we put our talents to work and see what we can do to organize around this? Mindful that the city infrastructure was completely falling apart. So they did that. And the public health director, Cruzen, joined with them thinking this is the best opportunity to manage this epidemic. So what this committee did was they created a headquarters in a major department store in Philadelphia. They advertised a phone number and they said, anything you people in the public, any flu related problem you've got where you need help, call this number. Now, somebody on the receiving end in the department store was there to analyze the situation, get information, determine exactly what resources are needed. We didn't want the example of the doctor going out on that house call and being surrounded by 50 people. We wanted things controlled. So the city was divided up into districts. Each district was assigned certain doctors and maybe nurses. And those medical people would not go outside of the district. So somebody might actually take that phone call and go out and check at the location where the need was to determine what's really required here. Maybe what the caller asked for is not the most appropriate solution. So somebody then would go back, make the decision in this volunteer center, and then call out the appropriate people. Since ambulances weren't running, just like taxis weren't, the taxi drivers were mostly down sick, private citizens were coming forth and volunteering their own private cars. And to signify they were emergency vehicles, they were given a green flag to set on their car to give them the right of way. So citizens are really beginning to kick in through this voluntary organization that's setting up sort of a just on the hoof emergency operations center. They're also opening food kitchens, particularly in those areas that are poverty stricken where people can't get out and can't get food. So if there is a heroic story here, it has the face of the nurse and the face of the volunteer. Doctors really couldn't do anything about this disease, but nurses in whatever palliative care they could exercise were doing what they could. And by the way, doctors and nurses, of course, are contracting disease and dying just like everybody else. This is a photograph that the Conway family of Philadelphia has in its sort of personal archive. It's taken in the 1920s. It shows these two boys and two other children, a baby and a very young girl. But to the family today, looking at this photograph, what's in it is just as significant as what is not in it. Now, the Conway family immigrated from Ireland. The parents, I think the names were Margaret and Patrick, both came down with flu, but they still had to manage a household, and Patrick had to go out and do his war work. They had a daughter, Elizabeth, who's not in this picture for a reason. Elizabeth was 3 years old, and Elizabeth died of the flu. Now, the family remembered her and continues to remember Elizabeth as a very lively girl who loved to stage tea parties with her dolls. She dies. And just think of those large statistics I was giving you earlier about the number of people dead and how the death rate skyrocketed. And this was happening over about a 6-week period with this extremely high mortality that led to the complete breakdown of city infrastructure. People died, had to dispose of bodies. They might bury bodies in their own backyards, sometimes take them to graveyards and just leave them there for somebody else to pick up and bury, or they went into those mass graves. But Elizabeth was one of those. There was no fanfare, there was no funeral because that would be a public gathering. So the family, for years afterwards, could recall the father, while he still lived, would occasionally absent himself from family affairs, go down in the basement by himself and get out the dolls and the tea party and set them up and sit there in quiet contemplation. That's the kind of individual suffering and trauma that families experienced and simply had to suck up and keep to themselves. By November, things are ending. The official closure time for Philadelphia was 6 weeks. After 6 weeks, the leisure entertainments opened again, but there continued to be flu cases and other bumps of flu variants hitting the town over the next several months. Some people in the United States continue to see bumps of flu outbreaks into 1920, 21, and even early 1922. So it had some staying power. But by November, not only do we have this winding down in Philly, but the war reaches a conclusion. It reaches an armistice. But it's worth remembering soldier casualties in wartime. During the American Civil War in the 1860s, approximately 1 person died in combat for every 2 people who died due to disease. And thereafter, such as in subsequent big wars, that was not the case. You would have far fewer cases due to disease than you had people dying in combat, except for World War I. You had more people dying of disease than died of combat. And where the disease is concerned, these are over 90% flu cases. So the flu hit hard the US Army and actually killed more soldiers than the enemy did. But the mortality begins to decline in Philadelphia and other places. And you see here an in remembrance tablet that's not in Philadelphia, it's somewhere else. In some cemeteries in Philadelphia, there are actual dates, such as in these to the left, lower left, where one of them gives a death date of October 7th, 1918, thus indicating this is in all likelihood a flu death. And in some of the major cemeteries of Philadelphia today that have been around since at least then, you can go to the cemetery administrator and ask about the flu graves, and they can always point them out to you whether they are identified on the stone or not. And every cemetery has them. Jean Chinook, another Philadelphian, who was remembered by her family as being the worrywart, constant worrying about everything. And she became a little bit of a object of fun in her family. The back of the house abutted a pond. And when this pond water level would drop, Jean would get frantic that there was environmental catastrophe that was imminent. This is the kind of worrywart she was for the family. But there was one time, and one time only, that she recalled an experience when she was a child. She was a child, about 7 or 8 years old, when the flu hit Philadelphia. And this is a child who grew up to be a woman whose father committed suicide, and who then had to, of course, live through the Great Depression and then World War II. So there were plenty of things to worry about. But in 1918, her childhood memory was she got sick. She got very sick, and she had the flu. But as she was recovering, she got up one day and walked out onto the front porch of her suburban house. And she wondered why it was that the neighbors across the street, whom she knew, were all lying down asleep in the front yard. And she looked up and down the street and saw other people like that, just corpses on front lawns ready to be picked up. Maybe it was Frank Bieberstein and his other seminary mate who were about to show up with a horse-drawn cart to collect the dead. It didn't dawn on her until later that these people were all dead, and this wasn't some make-believe thing. So what had just happened? In the experience of the flu in the United States, 1 in 4 Americans gets the flu. Now, for, as I said, a 6-week period, the Philadelphia death rate was quite high. It was actually 1 Philadelphian every 5 minutes for approximately 12,000. And over the course of a few months, it was approximately 20,000 dead. Now, whenever we come into flu season and there's a pressure on to get vaccinations, and we feel like we've been there, done that, we do this every year, and people get kind of inured to it. There's always the advice, the very young, the very old are most at risk for the disease. But for the flu, it was a little different. Young adults were particularly susceptible to the flu. So if you imagine a curve on a graph by age, there's a big spike for healthy young adults. And the onset and the mortality could be so rapid that you could be a 25-year-old healthy male who sets off and goes to war work in one of those war industries, feeling a bit queasy by noon, and you have to leave work early and go home at 3 o'clock, lie down because you're feeling sweaty and exhausted and your aches and pains. And think of those symptoms I showed you earlier with the blue face and so on, the musty straw and all that. You could be dead by 6 p.m., by supper time. And along with the odor, those extreme cases, by the way, had a very bad sound effect to them as the lungs dissolved and the lungs filled up with a frothy, bloody mix. People were described as emitting, when they breathed, a kind of crackling sound, as if you had bubble wrap that you crackled in your fingers. That's the sound of your alveoli, those air sacs in your lungs exploding. Now here's the President of the United States once again, President Wilson. Censorship continued to operate with major newspapers. It was always the war news that predominated. Even when the armistice was reached, It was war news, occupation news, because we kept soldiers in France well into 1919 and started to gradually phase them out and bring them home. But the President of the United States, during the entire flu epidemic in the United States, or pandemic as it became, did not once make a public utterance about the disease, not once. There was no big drive by federal agencies to provide any aid to localities, excuse me. Localities were left to their own resources. In some cases, people had to behave like pirates. There was one city, not Philadelphia, that had ordered a number of wooden coffins built for them, and they were placed on a train and on their way to the destination city. They were, in fact, intercepted, train stopped by representatives of another city, which simply took the coffins and stole them. So such was the state of things in the United States. There was no big public aid program, no food supplements from on high. The federal government really did not appear to help anybody. As I said, the infrastructure collapse was fairly immediate, and it took months to recover, but it had kind of a hit and run nature. So institutions such as hospitals picked up the pieces, became fully staffed eventually, and went on with business. So nothing really changed in the healthcare arena or in the political arena. The fact that the flu cases were not always reportable to the same degree that they became in Philadelphia, or they became reportable at different times, didn't really help anything because there was no central United States data gathering center to look at the data, collect the data, and analyze data. There were some long-term effects of this. What is now the World Health Organization, which is the watchdog for world pandemics and any disease outbreak anywhere, it actually derives from a bureau that was created in Vienna, Austria, right after the war, about 1919, specifically to start collecting data on diseases. And so indirectly, the WHO is an outgrowth of the flu pandemic of 1918. There were other problems, of course, that were unanticipated. In Philadelphia, you had a lot of orphans. You had adults being stricken and in some cases dying in their homes or being unable to do anything. It would rob people of strength to such a degree that they simply did not have energy. There was a nurse who went into a private home and found in one room, father in a chair, dead, mother who had just given birth, trying to nurse a child, but had not even enough strength to reach across the table she was sitting next to and take the apple that was there and eat it. And it had been there for days. So this is the state of things. But where parents were immobilized or even dead, children would just leave and roam the streets. The problem was so bad that the mayor's office simply said, look, if you find a kid just wandering around out there, just take him in. You didn't go through any agency. There's no paperwork, just do it. This is a statement from an historian, and I had to put it in here because it really speaks to the world picture. The flu resculpted human populations more radically than anything since the Black Death. And with World War I ending, now the peace negotiations take place in Versailles, and the world is shaped for the next World War, but also for the 20th and 21st century. And some of the political problems that we deal with today are a direct outgrowth of the settlement at the end of World War I. But the settlement at World War I in Versailles was also tempered by flu. President Wilson himself came down with a perilous case of the flu. Some of his senior advisors took sick and died. And he was immobilized for a good long period. And there was a question, what do we do? Is it time for the vice president to step in or what? And in his case, the country kind of kept it secret and until he started to recover and could regain a public voice again. But it was a very dangerous time. But with everything else going on, the scientific quest to understand what the flu is all about really started in earnest. Starting in 1918, but continuing into the 1930s, there was hard research going on, not only in the US, but in other countries. But it wasn't until 1933 that the virus was actually identified. But you see here, it wasn't until the end of World War II that we had a viable vaccine. But there were changes in public health and in the larger world arena of public health, particularly. The Soviet Union, the new Soviet Union as it happened, was one of the first to create a centralized public health program, gather data and train doctors in public health, and particularly as to awaken doctors to the need to observe and document the social conditions that give rise to disease. And that was pretty far-seeing thing to do at the time. The US started to do that later on. It wasn't until the 1930s that there was a first national health survey in the United States. Now, the picture of the mine that's floating here, I think, is an apt image of a flu virus. You see something like this for COVID today. But there are a lot of flu variants. And if you got a flu vaccine last year, you got a variant for type H1N1. The H is hemagglutinin and neuraminidase. And these two are the highly destructive, I think proteins is the right category for them, that really do damage. One of them is the thing that hacks open those alveoli cells. The other one gets in there and reproduces with other live healthy cells to start creating diseased cells and to propagate the virus through your own bodily system of cellular reproduction. So it's pretty insidious. But the H1N1 variant that we experience with vaccines now, and every pandemic we've had since 1918, we had one in 1957, not as destructive. We had the swine flu in 2009, not as destructive, but still high mortality. All those flus are genetically descended from the 1918 flu. To this day, we do not know why the 1918 flu was the killer that it was. But we've been on notice for the last several years that pandemics were coming. In 2016, there was an international conference that looked at the likelihood of flu pandemics in the future. And they thought there was a significant likelihood that over the next century, about 4 pandemics would visit the human population, at least one of which could be the flu. Here you see Time magazine from 1917. This speaks to COVID. Science, having a more scientifically oriented thing. Other pieces of mainstream journalism were forecasting that this is going to happen and that we are not prepared for it, and we don't have a real global system for handling it. This is a word I cannot pronounce. I won't try. It's a word in the language of the Yupik people of Alaska. Alaska experienced the highest mortality due to the 1918 flu of any part of the United States. Approximately 40% of native populations in the eastern part of Alaska died. Whole villages were wiped out. Well, the experience of this was so traumatic that the Yupik people created a word for it. This is not a word that means flu or means pandemic. It means forgetting. They decided to blot it out from their oral history. Don't mention it. Don't pass it on. Don't ever talk about this suffering. Don't ever talk about anything connected to this event. It didn't happen, or it did happen, but we're going to let time efface it, just as it has effaced all those lives. So that's one way some people have decided to cope with a memory of this. It's called the forgotten pandemic because World War I was going on, and that was the preeminent narrative. So how do we remember something like this? Well, you've got the stories, the family stories, like the Conway family, the Chinook family. We don't have the heroic narratives. The medical work to find a vaccine went on for years, so they're not really 1918 heroes as such. It's not like you have generals in the battlefield with swords up and directing troops. Disease just happens. It just shows up, grabs people, makes a lot of people sick, and then somehow just disappears, which is one of its frustrating aspects, of course. But the scientific language to talk about the flu and talk about viruses has been evolving ever since, and not hardly a forgotten pandemic. Even within the first 10 years after the flu, we had over 4,000 books being published in this country. There's very little material evidence. So no impact on institutions. People picked up and went back to it. The war being the preeminent narrative. So what we have are individual narratives that have been kept alive over time by families, but there was never a moment of any public commemoration. I mean, with COVID, with President Biden, we've seen at least 2 now. Undoubtedly, we're going to see something more. And some artist out there is going to design the national memorial for COVID victims when this is all over with. And maybe, be comparable to a Vietnam War memorial, but we don't have anything like that now. And Philadelphia has no memorials whatsoever to the flu pandemic coming through town and killing so many people. So we have personal narratives buried in personal stories and personal families. What did we do here at the Mutter Museum? In late 2019, we opened Spitz-Fred's Death. Now, we've been accused of having some special pipeline in the cosmos, knowing what was about to happen with COVID. But what we knew was something like COVID's been predicted and is bound to happen. So this will be a good time to review Philadelphia's case. Now, Philadelphia and Scranton and Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, had the highest mortality rates of any American city. So we do get singled out in some of the larger academic discussions about the flu. This exhibit, by the way, is going to be open for several years. So if you happen to be in Philly, do come and see it. But we wanted to approach this in an unusual way, not just create a little historical presentation and throw up large numbers, but what was it like for those families? What was it like for individual people? We want people coming through and thinking to themselves, what would I do? What's my responsibility to myself, my family, my community when these things happen? These are the funders, and this is the most expensive exhibit project we've had, and it had multiple features, including public health fair, walking tours through what were flu-ridden neighborhoods, and other things. But with so few material artifacts, where do you get things that help tell the story? The Catholic Archdiocese has all those pictures of those mass graves and coffins being picked up. You even see one of those horse-drawn carts in this photograph at lower right. In our museum, of course, we had bedpans, things like that. Bryn Mawr College, they had correspondence between a student and parents on the outside because the college campus itself quarantined. So the student could not leave, nobody could come in. But one of the most poignant things, we found there was a costume collection at Drexel University here in Philly. There was a woman named Naomi Ford, a very young mother and wife, who decided to do some early Christmas shopping in the fall of 2018 and buy some high fashion items for the women in her family and her women friends. Well, she did that. She wrote out the tags, put things in gift boxes, and wrote poems on some of them, and then died of the flu. Her family stuck everything up in the attic and kept it out of sight for generations until it finally got into the costume collection. So what you see here is a brand new purse in 1918, high fashion item, purchased for a woman friend. There's a handwritten tag by Naomi Ford and has a gift box. What other thing can you suggest to show people the impact of the flu than an undelivered Christmas present? But also, Philadelphia recently put online all the death certificates for all the people who died during that time. So we ended up mining all this material and created a database of 20,000 death certificates. And these are like mini biographies, where people came from, their parents, are they married, not, where do they live? And in our exhibit, we've done something unusual. We created some computer-driven interactives, which is something we don't normally do, to allow people to explore what happened in their neighborhood, what happened in their city. You're a school teacher, you come in, did school teachers die? You can interrogate the system and find out. But one of the most important parts of this was I wanted to bring in artists and commission a work of art that spoke to the pandemic somehow, not just illustrated an exhibit. And we brought in the people at Upper Right Blast Theory. It's a collective in the United Kingdom. And they looked around, studied historical material and said, you know, we do a lot of public art with large numbers of people. How about we recreate the Liberty Loan Parade of 1918? Well, I kind of went faint at that one, but what we did was a very limited parade, but a very special one. People who signed up for the parade could choose the name of a flu victim. All the flu victims represented on these placards, you see all the names people were carrying down below, represent somebody who died on October 12th, the highest mortality day in Philly. The reverse side of those placards has the death certificate of the person. The woman here holding Anna Golden up is actually the descendant of Anna Golden. And those two big white walls are mobile walls that are illuminated from within. The parade started at dusk, followed the original parade route to City Hall, and you see people in the dark arriving. But one of the unusual features was the music. People with those cards, each one would singly pass through those walls and have a moment of reflection to themselves, where they got a chance to highlight the name of one person who died. And then that person would fall behind and somebody else would step in. So everybody got a chance to do this. But an award-winning choir known as The Crossing was commissioned, music was performed, like a Gregorian chant, but with the names of the dead and instructions for avoiding the flu were the lyrics. And in that, the music, the choir wasn't there. People were holding up their mobile phones, all dialed to the same number. So you were surrounded by this ambient Gregorian chant as you walked. And it was an extremely poignant experience to do this. This is a parade that we held 101 days, 101 years to the day after the Liberty Loan Parade of 1918. And it is the first public commemoration of the flu pandemic in Philadelphia, 101 years later. I thank you. And before I leave it for questions, here's some good advice to 1918 style. But remember that button I pointed out that the nurse was wearing under her smock? Well, it turns out that's a Liberty Loan button. She has bought a war bond. And I want to show you, I got one too. So if you folks are not wearing honor buttons, you're all slackers. So you need to get out and buy a war bond. We are open for questions. Thank you very much.
So feel free to unmute and ask your question. I didn't see any come through on the chat. I tried to upload the file, if y'all noticed, with the suggested reading, but it looks like there might be some issues. So that suggested reading list is also on our website under the virtual programming page, or you can email us and we'll send you a copy as well. But yeah, feel free to unmute and anything you're curious about. I was curious, actually, how much was a war bond? What was like the cheapest war bond that you could get?
Oh man, that's a good question. I think even kids could go up and pay a dime and get something.
Okay.
Well, and it kind of went from there. They made it as easy as possible for you to give money. So any amount you were given, you got a pin. I don't think you got a bond unless you're buying at least $5 or $10 worth, as I recall. It's been a while since I've seen an image of those bonds, but and then it went up from there. I mean, clearly you could give as much as they could drag out of you. And remember, this is the 4th Liberty Loan Parade, Liberty Loan Fund Drive nationally. So there were 3 others. In fact, there was still another one coming, the 5th, even officially after the war ended, because they still needed to raise the money. Our troops are still out there. So there was a constant demand to open wallets and give money for this effort.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
So people were, I'm sorry. We have a question?
Yeah. Did the mayor of Philadelphia put out a mask ordinance or whatever you might want to call it that either recommended or required that people wear masks?
The word was promoted through the Red Cross and through local authorities that wearing masks is a good idea if you're going to be close to people. People started doing all kinds of avoidance things on their own. They'd cross the street if there was somebody coming towards them that they recognized. And so there was some social distancing just seemed to happen spontaneously. Philadelphia did not mandate the wearing of masks throughout this. Other cities did. And as I said earlier, the gauze mask would really not have been effective against the flu. But Seattle, for example, made it a city mandate to wear a mask, and you were fined for a misdemeanor if you did not wear one in public. Seattle had an interesting experience because they didn't get the severe hit, or as severe as Philadelphia did. But after their flu cases subsided, people then spontaneously started taking off the masks on their own. Then they had another bump of the flu. And theoretically, under that law, they passed for themselves, they should put masks on. But after the first flu, nobody had the willingness to do this. So it didn't seem to work the first time, so let's just not bother. So they just disregarded the law and eventually it was repealed. But some cities did have ordinances. Philadelphia did not. I'd like to comment on one thing, maybe a bit of a loose end. I emphasized a couple of private stories, private family stories, like the Conway family. One of the unforeseen aspects of creating this exhibit and opening it is that even when our museum was closed for several months because of COVID, initially, at least for the first 4 or 5 months of COVID, journalists were very eager to find out what they could about the 1918 flu, to see what parallels. And like mask wearing is a good example. And they came to the Motor Museum frequently, and I seemed to be on the phone a great deal with them discussing COVID in relationship to the flu. But I said that one thing that has happened over the course of the last, year and several months, about 8 months since the museum actually opened the exhibit, even though the museum was closed for a big hunk of time, is that people responded to the press, which was considerable. We even were featured on the front page of the Sunday New York Times in April about this. We got a lot of press coverage. So people began to show up at the museum very spontaneously and bring copies of family pictures, family mementos, and email us with stories. So we put up both online and even in the exhibit, if you've got a family story, please contact us because we'd like to know about these stories. And what's fascinating about the stories is the people who have contacted us, and we've collected about over 70 stories so far. None of these people were alive in 1918. They may not have even known somebody who was alive in 1918, and yet they still talk about their family trauma as if that trauma has not evaporated. It's still felt in the family. And some of the stories are range from even funny to just grotesque. And I think the best example I've got of the latter was about death certificates. Now, the city required an inspection of a body before issuing a death certificate. Because the bodies were just piling up and people were just burying bodies, it was impossible to do that. So there was one family that wanted a death certificate for a child and contacted the city office of records to see about getting that death certificate. Well, there was nobody to come out and see that family. And so the person at the city office said, look, you have to come down here in person. We can't just issue a death certificate. Body has to be verified. That's the law. So the father took the body of the child on public transportation to downtown Philly, walked into that office, put the child down and said, here's the corpse. This is my child. I want a death certificate. So that's the kind of story we've been collecting. That's on the more grotesque end of things. And then we get everything in between. What we decided to do was to help commemorate all of this by creating a website, which is a digital scrapbook of these stories. And where families have photographs or other documents, we feature them. So if you should happen to go to the Motor Museum website, and somewhere on that site, maybe in connection with a page on the Spitspread's death, there's a link to that, and you can read more stories. I've stunned you all into silence.
So Robert, one of the things we're doing here is we have a collecting program for COVID. It's been pretty quiet. I'm not sure if people know what to send in. So looking back on the research you had to do for this exhibition and program, what are the things that we should be collecting or that you wish you had found more of in the research process? That's
a really good question. And that's been, although I'm not museum head anymore, I'm still in discussion about these things. And are you part of the working group that includes the Smithsonian, the COVID Memorial Project, I think it's called? Consortium?
No, but we should be.
Well, send me an email.
Okay.
And I'll connect you with Anna Doty, our curator, who's a participant. There's a larger conversation taking place in the museum world about who's going to collect what. The Smithsonian, for example, has been able to get the original vial of vaccine that was used in the United States. I don't know how they did it, but they did. But there's a conversation, who ought to collect what? Think correspondence, think particularly public advisories, public notices, and with so much being conveyed on the internet, it becomes a problem in how to collect things. It's a difficult thing to talk to hospitals. If you know some infectious disease doctors or hospital administrators, you might raise the question with them. Because even things like boxes that contain the ampules for the vaccine, Well, there's no reason why you couldn't collect some of the boxes. If some of the places even vaccinating were giving like pins or, like the I voted stickers. And I say with great irritation that the place where I got my vaccine, both vaccinations, didn't give anything except show you the door on the way out. But some places did. Those kinds of things are very collectible, but anything particularly that highlights stories, I think in light of the storytelling aspect of this, if it's possible to even now interview and make recordings of people who have had COVID, who have been hospitalized, who have lost loved ones, experienced some kind of privation, you're going to get a spectrum of stories you can't even imagine that could be very useful for storytelling in the future. The material side of this is just tough. A lot of hospital stuff they don't want to give you because for obvious reasons. I don't know that I can really enlarge upon that. We just chanced upon this collection of costume, this Naomi Ford costume collection. I mean, we never imagined there was a collection of undelivered Christmas presents with gift tags from somebody who died of the flu. But if you ask around, there's stuff out there. I would also check, mindful of our best sources, turn out to be things, organizations like the Catholic Archdiocese. Those organizations that do have an ability to help. And the Catholic Diocese in Philly had still nurses that wanted to volunteer in hospitals. That became an issue because they contacted the taxi companies to get regular pickup and drop-off service, and they couldn't get it because too many taxi drivers were sick. And the Catholic Archdiocese has correspondence which reflects all that, which we thought, hey, we're going to use that sometime. So places that you might not normally expect, like the churches. Catholic Archdiocese keeps very great records. Social service agencies that might have had a role, and just ask what they have of material culture nature. I mean, you have to use your imagination because no one's going to know right offhand because nobody's thinking collecting. But I think it would be good to tune into this consortium conversation because people were talking exactly about what ought to be collected and who ought to collect it.
Those are some good ideas. Thank you. And Melissa just offered her big text COVID sticker. So we'll take you up on that, Melissa. Only in Texas.
Yeah.
I did have one other quick question. You talked about the rush of reporters that came in when COVID began. I'm just wondering, I don't know if they're still rushing you, but what is there to learn maybe about the transition out of the pandemic?
Oh my gosh.
History?
In 1918, because there was no big public commemoration and it was not a topic of national discussion and debate, localities just wanted to get the boys back from France, bring everybody back, bring the whole infrastructure of medicine that we had put in military service, bring it back, all of the American cities, and get on with things. So nothing of any substance, federal programs, emergency planning, any of that changed. It was, let's just get the war effort taken care of. Let's seal that up. Let's get out of Europe, get back. And the flu was not really a topic of public discussion, oddly enough. So commemorative activities didn't take place, or you didn't see like committees formed to say, now that we've gone through this, let's look at what we just did and figure out what did we do well, what did we not do well. These activities just did not take place, which is peculiar. It's also difficult from a museum perspective to go back and try to reconstruct some of these circumstances and do an exhibit on it, which in a way is precisely the reason why we ought to do it. It's not talked about, but it was so significant. I don't know if I'm answering your question very well. The reporters, I should say, these days call in pulses. Every time that there's some new thing in the news, COVID related, some new benchmark, then the calls come in. Mask is a good example. Now that people are starting to lift mask requirements in various ways and places, now the reporters want to call up and find out, how did they do that in 1918? And the answer is, well, they just threw them away and stopped wearing them. That's pretty much what happened. And not everybody wore them. By the way, the Red Cross was as good as the federal government in putting up these patriotic posters, and they like to use a lot of catchphrases and rhymes to get people to remember to do things. And the Red Cross, in encouraging people to wear masks, had this really colorful ditty that went like this, showed a person putting a mask on, and the little rhyme was, obey the laws and wear the gauze. Protect your paws from septic jaws. What else can I disillusion everybody about?
All right. No other questions?
Okay. All right then. Well, if there's no other questions, just thank you, Dr. Hicks, for your time today and for such an informative and fascinating presentation. We really appreciate you, and thank you everyone for coming.
Appreciate having an opportunity to visit Texas today.
Yes.